Here on this page, I am paying tribute to one of the most prestigious wines in the world, a true jewel of the Bordeaux region, Château Margaux. Château Margaux was classified as a first gross Premier Grand Cru classé already in 1855. Only 5 estates were given this top ranking, placing it among the elite of global wine. This image is from a vintage book. I believe that this is this book. 1999. At the background, you can see this shabby textured collaging that I made from these small antique paper dividers used for storing wine bottle foils. You see? I have included here a vintage book extract with the image of Château Margaux, the small chateau. It comes from this book. From 1950. There is also an extract from an antique or very old vintage wine menu listing Bordeaux red wines, including Margaux, from 1913 to 1925. And here is an authentic Margaux wine label from 1924. Here to the right, there is an antique ledger page with eco-printed grapes leaf, and I have added a range of antique red wine foils. Here there is a side pocket made of some tracing paper on which I printed this image. Another extract from the book on chateaux with the Margaux wine. There are some labels. 1949. Château du Tertre, appellation Margaux, 1985, and a Bordeaux label of 1992. Here there is another page from the vintage directory, the Grand Cru de la Gironde. More labels, an antique Bordeaux label, 1920, very old. A vintage one, another vintage. Here I have made a large belly band using one of the images from the book The Wine in Paintings. This is a 19th century painting of Baudelaire and other writers drinking wine. I have added some crackling effect. Behind there is a fussy cut of a wine bottle image that can be used as a bookmark. Here this page has an article with some advice about keeping a wine cellar. There is an antique postcard with a wine cellar in Burgundy. a big journaling card. Here there is an extract from an antique diary suggesting a model how to take notes about a wine cellar. An antique burlap scrap. Behind there is a small tuck spot where I have added some more antique wine labels. Another tuck spot with a big journaling card. A vintage wine label. And an extract from an antique diary, Agenda Foyer du Petit Saint-Thomas, with lovely grapes images. And this was the center of the wine menu from the Ritz Hotel, Carte des Vins. I have just added these fascicles of wine openers and a fascicle of the tissue paper on which I stamped a grape sleeve. Here I have made two tuck spots with grapes images. Inside I have put a double page from a vintage book about the wine of France in the history, 1953. A vintage, almost antique invoice by a wine merchant. Another vintage book page and some vintage wine labels. I will show you the books. I believe this image comes from this book. Sorry. From 1964. And as regards this page, it also comes from a vintage book. I believe that is this one, Le Vrai Livre du Vin, from 1982. Here there is a tuck spot from antique fabric. Some antique Burgundy wine labels. Vintage or antique book page. Let me see. I believe it comes from this book, dating 1929. This image here makes me think about the delivery of wines to the Ritz Hotel just after its opening in 1898. Some more antique muslin, eco-dyed. Another vintage business directory page with the Saint-Emilion Grand Cru wine. Another antique ledger page with an eco print of a grape sleeve, a tuck spot made of a vintage photo of some vineyards as far as I can see. A small tag with a hidden pocket. A vintage wine label. You can see the eco print better from this side. And this page is dedicated to the wine Romanée Conti. Our wine story would be incomplete without mentioning this legendary wine. Romanée Conti wines are considered among the most rare, prestigious and expensive wines in the world. They are produced in Burgundy. These wines are often regarded as the pinnacle of Pinot Noir. Romanée Conti regularly sells for $15,000 to $50,000 per bottle, with rare vintages fetching hundreds of thousands at auction. It's a status symbol and a collector's dream, often described as the wine of kings and the king of wines. When making this journal, I promised myself not to use any laces. But I have not kept this promise and have added this absolutely stunning 19th century lace with grapes motifs. Let's have a closer look. By the way, the clip is also antique. I think I attached it by the wrong side, because look down here, there are these very delicate flowers and leaves, and I also love this contrasting black tulle. Yes, and in fact this is a large pocket, and inside I have put an extract from a vintage book with some eco-dyed antique muslin. Here there is a list of wines and years, and a brief explanation whether the year was good or not, from 1860s to 1950s. This page comes from this vintage book. From 1960. Here I have created two big pockets in the form of paintings. I used the same technique, using masking tape and gilding wax for creating frames. And the image comes from the book that I showed you before. Here is this image. Again, this is an original extract from the book. I have added two journaling cards that I have embellished with this gold thread antique trims. And I have added this tag. It's another extract from the same book page with the description of the painting. Les vendanges en Bourgogne, the wine harvesting in Burgundy. Here there is another vintage book page with some beautiful wine decanters, a small antique fabric scrap, here to the right there is a vintage menu page with a fussy cut of a wine bottle opener. If you flip over cards or pages, This one comes from the book about paintings and the wine. This trim is antique silk from a corset that I mentioned. There is this beautiful champagne label that can be used as a journaling card, some antique muslin, and here there is also a scrap from an antique book about wines, space for journaling, and here you can see the same gold thread trim with grapes that is used for the closures. Here you can see gorgeous antique wine bottle foils. A piece of an antique or vintage, I don't remember, we'll see further on, bear share. A tuck spot made of a vintage postcard from 1937. Beautiful image. Here some space for journaling, a small tuck spot with more wine labels. A fussy cut of grapes, another page from a wine cellar logbook. A side pocket. Cover, or rather dust jacket from an antique or vintage book. A pretty champagne label from 1988. A vintage label. An envelope from 1963. Yes, I also stamped it with a grapes leaf. I think it was just so addictive. Here to the right there is a very special antique document. It's a vineyard partition notary deed from 1850. It fits really perfectly in this journal, doesn't it? There are some antique wine bottle foils that I have glued here and embellished with some antique thread. Here you can see a small pocket, a champagne label, a vintage wine label, a scrap from a vintage book. This spread is an extract from an antique topographical map of Bonn, the heart of Burgundy. It's very rare indeed. And here I made this tuck spot of a piece of acetate. I think I was inspired by the image of these glasses. So I used stencils and put some texture paste, semi-translucent I believe, and I created this gold trim using gold leaves like this. This image comes from the vintage book on chateaux that I showed you. There is a scrap of antique fabric with grapes image, an antique ledger page, more labels here. This one is antique, vintage, a champagne label, another beautiful vintage wine label. The other part of the 1850 notary vineyards partition deed. Here another page from a vintage wine cellar logbook, a tuck spot that I made from a wallpaper sample. Here I have played a little bit with grape leaves jelly printing. An antique Bordeaux label. I believe this is also antique. And a vintage wine label. Here there is a thin belly band, behind which I have included another image from a vintage book with some journaling space behind. Here also you can take plenty of notes. Another vintage wine label glued to the bearer share. I cannot see the year here. Here there is another part of the vintage menu and a side pocket or tuck spot from antique fabric. Here there is an invoice for wine dating 1920. A vintage or antique photo. A very nice thin Armagnac label. And a wine label that can be used as a journaling card. This wine label is modern. I just like this wine and I liked this wine label. Some stenciling, a vintage letter by a wine merchant, 1954. An image from a vintage book that can be used for journaling. Here there is a tuck spot that I made using some antique black velvet. I glued it on cardstock first. Here there is an antique wine bottle foil, a piece from antique binding, some space for journaling, more vintage wine labels. Here you can see some gorgeous marbled paper, a tuck spot or side pocket from an antique fabric. It comes actually from men's shirt. Again, I wanted not to forget those working hard in the vineyards. A pretty champagne label, a card or pocket, another marbled paper, beautiful image. Here there is something else. Another invoice, an antique one for wine dating 1925. A journaling card that I have embellished with a piece of a vintage kitchen towel. You know, in France there are collectible kitchen towels with different beautiful images, and this one was with wines. Inside there is a vintage wine label and a beautiful grapes image. Here to the right there is another antique ledger page and a belly band that I made from a piece of transparency on which I printed this image of grapes. Here there is a shallow pocket, a beautiful image from the vintage book that I showed you. And here is something special. I will explain you what I mean. This is a part from the antique wine filter. You know, you remember in the beginning I mentioned that I bought quite a lot of winemaking material from the ancestor of a wine merchant in a flea market. So here is this filter, and I have stamped a grape sleeve on it like this. I probably could not see, but here there is a watermark inscription. Here there is a fragment from an antique linen kitchen towel. I have included plenty of wine labels. Saint-Emilion, this one is antique, 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 also antique, also antique, antique, antique. This one is vintage, vintage, antique, 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 antique. Here there is another image from the vintage book, and French cheese, the best friend of the wine. I wanted to say red wine, but not only actually. So you know, this piece of antique kitchen towel, it's like inviting us for a picnic with a bit of wine, good cheese. Here there is a page from a vintage wine menu. This ribbon here, in fact, I almost forgot it, and already after I made this journal, I realized that I needed to add it. It was in the middle of the Ritz Hotel wine menu used for this journal. Like, you know, all the pages were held together by this ribbon in the middle. Here I have created this belly band using an image from Burgundy. I have added these antique Burgundy wine labels. To the right there is a page from the vintage wine cellar book that we saw before, a tuck spot, a journaling card with some antique textile. I have added more beautiful wine labels, antique. 3 are antique and the last one is vintage. Here I have included another page from a vintage book, Les Côtes du Rhône. More vintage wine labels glued by the wine collector who had this book from 1970s. Here there is a beautiful large textile belly band. This is antique fabric, and inside I have included a Hotel Ritz menu. It's a restaurant menu from 1979. Another page from the vintage wine menu. Here you have the year 1934. Here there is another antique ledger page. I have used the image of wine related books here as a belly band. This beautiful grapes embroidery. Here you can touch it, you can see it from both sides. On this page there are 2 tuck spots. They are made of cardstock on which I glued this antique fabric from a men's clothing. Here on this journaling cards, there is a photo from a dinner from, I believe, 1900 Paris exposition, l'exposition universelle. Well, as you can see, there are only men here. I have added here a small ring. It's also antique. It comes from an antique curtain or something like this with some silk. Well, it makes me think of tablecloths here. And I have added a piece of antique chandelier. It is detachable and you can take it off and use it elsewhere. Here, this is some gift wrapping paper. There is a beautiful champagne label, an antique wine label. Here there is an antique letter sent from Bordeaux in 1827, I believe. And another gorgeous champagne label. Here there is another small belly band with plenty of wine bottles. Here there is another small textile belly band. I have put inside a vintage menu. And this page, here you can see it from both sides. comes from this book, Le Ritz de Paris. It's a vintage book. Let me see the year. 1991. So that is it. I hope you have enjoyed watching this video. Let me know. Thank you. Bye bye.